It's good to see every one of you here, and I also want to welcome our online group attendees as well as we are getting things set up here. I just want to say, even if you can't be here in person or you're not feeling up to it or whatever the reason is, we do have an online option, which is great. So I am thankful that we have that. Get all my things ready to go. We are continuing on in our series today of After God's Heart, which we've been studying the life of David. What's going on in his life? Why does he do what he does? And yet he's called a man after God's own heart. But what we're going to see very clearly today, David was far from perfect. He was far from perfect as he went through his life, and God had to keep working in him and shaping him. And we're going to come into some of the darkest days of David's life throughout our series today, and so our sermon today. So I hope I hope in some ways that it challenges you, but I hope also in some ways it really encourages you as well. So I know as I look around here, I see some people that I haven't seen before, or maybe haven't seen in a while. So definitely welcome back. I hope you've been able to tune into the series, at least online, if you haven't been able to be here yet. But I remember as a kid growing up, I remember when things would go wrong, there was a feeling that I had that somehow Dad could handle it. Especially when I was a young kid, very young, something would be going on and I would get something off, misplaced, whatever it was. Got to get Dad involved because somehow Dad's going to be able to handle it. As you get older, you begin to be a little more jaded about that, maybe a little bit. You begin to think that, sure, my dad's pretty good. He can handle a lot of things, but I'm not sure he can handle everything. And so what do? We end up taking it on ourselves. And so I think sometimes, even in this life, just this morning as I was driving into church this morning, I'm coming in and I'm driving throughout our neighborhood and I'm seeing people who are outside, believe it or not, braving the chilly morning air to do their own thing as they're out there playing basketball or they're out there working in the yard and everything else. I don't want to stand in judgment of anybody who's not here on a Sunday morning or someplace else on a Sunday morning. But I think to myself, I wonder how many people are living their lives in such a way that they have an amazing awareness that God can handle it. And I think the reason why we come together for a worship service, the reason why we sing the songs that we do, the reason why we do the things that we do, because it reminds us of how great God is, how powerful God is, how amazing He can be and the things that He can do, and how oftentimes pretty weak and incapable we are. And so when we come to a worship service, it reminds us of the greatness of God. And I think there are times when we go through life where we are kind of stuck and we think it's up to us. We think that we are the ones who have to make things happen. And when things don't go right, it sends us oftentimes into a tailspin. And this may happen when it comes to certainly our world. How many of you are sick of political ads by now? I'll tell you, based on your perspective, if the one candidate gets in, the world is coming to an end, correct? Based on your perspective. And if the other candidate gets in, it's going to be heaven on earth, correct? No, I heard from the background. Can God handle the political situation that we're in right now? How many of you have been acting like that this week? Just asking, We look at our family situation and we go through struggles and challenges in life and we think, oh yeah, God, He can handle this sort of thing. And yet, when we look at our unique situation, we're like, I don't know what God's going to do in this one. This is bad. I need to control. I need to act. I need to do something. And so oftentimes we act as if God can't handle it. This morning, the message is called Family in Ruins. As David is going in his life and he's going through stuff, his family is about in shambles. This man after God's own heart, this man who walked with God and saw God do amazing things, and we've looked at some of those throughout the series, and yet he's come to a stage in his life, his later years, where his family's against him, his entire kingdom seems to be leaving him, and we're sitting there looking at David, and he's in despair, he's depressed, he's ran out of Jerusalem, and he's sitting there wondering, what in the world am I going to do? And yet it's during this whole thing that God reminds him, David, I can handle it. David, I can handle it. And so I don't know what you're going to be facing today. I don't know what your challenges are going through. Maybe it's global in the sense of the political climate or whatever else. Maybe it's very local for you. It's your family. It's your job. It's your financial situation. Whatever it is. I don't know what it is. But I hope that through here this message can come through very loud and clear. And that is to you. God can handle it. Okay? So with that, I want you to turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 13. By the way, we're doing, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. We're doing 7 chapters today. So I hope you're ready. I hope you brought a lunch. Maybe a pillow. Some of you don't need pillows. You sleep just fine. 2 Samuel 13. And by the way, we're going to just skim these in case you were actually fearful of me taking too long here. Last week, when we talked, we dealt with Amnon and Tamar. And so we looked at that. And I would encourage you to go back. If you weren't here for the message, I'd encourage you to go online, frontlinebible.com. You can check out you can go to the listen section on the website and you can check out the previous week's sermons. But it would be a good perspective to get in. But we're not going to go back through the particular section there in 2 Samuel 13. But needless to say, Amnon was the oldest son of David, the oldest son. David had multiple wives and he had many children, and so this was the oldest son of his first wife. And Amnon had a really big problem, and so he ended up, and I know the Bible uses the word, he rapes Tamar, his own sister. And the devastation that caused in the family. And we read about a man by the name of Absalom, and Absalom was one of David's other sons. Absalom comes along and he gives some horrific advice. It's just your brother, don't worry about it. He gives some horrific advice to Tamar in this whole situation. But Absalom in that moment becomes a very key figure. He becomes a key figure in chapter 13 because it says that he ended up plotting in his own mind, I will repay Amnon for what he did to my sister. And so Absalom, he begins the plans. And sure enough, in 13, he devises a plan that he says, okay, David, hey, I need all the brothers. I want the whole family to come up to my place. We're going to have a great weekend. We're going to have a lot of fun. Just come on up. And David's like, why do you want us all up there? It stands to reason. It's kind of like, why are we doing a family reunion? We don't even like each other, it sounds like. And so he says, okay, why are we doing this? And David's like, well, I got to do this. So David says, okay, that's fine. That's fine, Absalom. You can have everybody there. I can't come, but you can get them up there. And so sure enough, while he's there, he tells his servants, I want you to kill Amnon while he's here. They do it. Word gets back to David. All of his sons are dead. Absalom killed them all. Well, it really wasn't true. It was the fact that Absalom had killed Amnon. The rest of them came back. But it's really interesting. There in 13, it's really interesting how David has said that he mourned for his son. He mourned for his son every day. And so, but he says there in verse 39, and the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. Amnon had done this horrific thing. Absalom was the one who murdered him. But in some way, it was kind of like justice was served finally. And so David, while he's upset over this whole thing, he somehow, strangely, he wants to go see Absalom again. Even though Absalom was the one that committed the murder. Why does he want to do it? Why is he so focused on this young man? We're not really told, but all we see is this thing begins to continue on throughout the passage. And so we're just going to skim through. We're going to skim through in which we're going to look at this idea of how God can handle it. How God can handle even this whole situation as this time period plays out and David ends up on the run, and how God is somehow still in control of all of it. And so as we begin to talk through it, so here we find, as we now move into chapter 14, we find that Absalom, we read about this Absalom, and God says, or David says, he can come back, but he can't be in my presence. I at least want him around, but he can't be in my presence. Joab works it all out. Finally, they're able to speak to each other. But through this whole thing, David doesn't realize the problems that he's dealing with. And the reason why is because Absalom was something pretty special. So if you look in 2 Samuel 14, verse 25. In all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. He would have been on the cover of GQ magazine. He would have been the most popular guy that's out there. He was super popular, and why? He would have made JD proud. If you look here, whenever, from the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut it from time to time when it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. 200 shekels, that's what the text actually says here. 200 shekels was 5 pounds. When he would cut his hair, he would have 5 pounds of hair. I'm envisioning the sweetest afro possible. That's what I'm envisioning, this humongous head of hair on him. Either that or it was super long and he'd roll it up like Rapunzel or something. Not exactly sure how it was there, but he had this big, thick head of hair. Fabio was from my generation. That's what I'm picturing, okay? Young people have no idea what I'm talking about there. You can Google it. But anyway, so you have this guy Absalom, super famous, he's super good looking, and he's the king's son. And so things are beginning to be afoot. If you look there in chapter 15, verse 1. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land. Then everyone who had a complaint or case would come to me, and I would see that he gets justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king, asking for justice. And listen what it says. And he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He stole the hearts. How did he do it? Well, he did it with his good looks. Yep, that's what it was. He stood out there and he was certainly good looking. He certainly caught the attention of everybody. Wow, amazed at this whole thing. But he also did it with his charm. He did it with his ability to be able to meet the needs of the people. And so, why was it the city gate? At the city gate, that's where people would go back in the day to have their grievances aired. And they would meet with the elders or meet with some judges or something. And that's where they would go to deal with their problems. And so Absalom would go stand out there every single day, get up early, and he would be there. In fact, the text actually tells us that this went on for about four years. And through this point in time, David somehow has this right underneath of his nose, doesn't even realize what's going on, and Absalom is slowly but surely winning the hearts of the people. And he would do it by connecting with their hometown. Well, hey, what town you from? Hey, I'm from this town. Man, it's so good to see you guys. So glad you're here today. Let me kiss the babies. Let me shake your hand. Let me embrace you. Oh, you know what? Oh, yes, I know I'm an important person, but hey, let me stand up for you. I'm not going to sit down. Doesn't it sound like he's politicking? Kissing babies, making friends with people, promising all the things that they're never going to deliver on, correct? It sounds like our political climate today, doesn't it? I want you to notice something. As we're going to see through this whole thing, we're going to see how God deals with Absalom and how he deals with future people. Because these people were power-hungry people. I want you to see how God can handle power-hungry people. Because Absalom, as we go through this time, we're going to see how Absalom begins to win the people's hearts away from David. And actually, David, the King of Kings, and I know that's a term reserved for God, but he was the king of the golden age of Israel. And yet even King David gets chased out of Jerusalem. And so as we go through here, Absalom, he comes to David and he says, hey, David, I want to go up to Hebron, which is the place where David was crowned king. He says, I want to go up to Hebron. I offer a sacrifice. I made a vow to God. I want to go up there to sacrifice. Can you let me go? David's like, sure, kind of weird, but that's okay. Go ahead and go. And while he's there, he gathers the support. And he even gathers the support of a guy by the name of Ahithophel. Now you say, what about Ahithophel? Ahithophel actually was a very trusted advisor of David. Now for some reason, Ahithophel was not there with David when he was there in Jerusalem. He had gone back home. Why might Ahithophel have gone back home? What we read later on in 2 Samuel 23, when we read about the lineage of David, and we read about his mighty men, one of the things that we read there was that there was a man by the name of Uriah the Hittite. If you remember Uriah's name, who was he married to? He was married to Bathsheba. And there was another guy who's the dad of Bathsheba was another guy of one of the mighty men. Maybe you don't remember this from that sermon, but his name was Eliakim. Eliakim was the dad's name. It's really interesting that in the list, we are told that Ahithophel was the dad of Eliakim, which would make Ahithophel, in case you're not paying attention, Ahithophel was what to Bathsheba? Grandpa. Grandpa. What did David do to Bathsheba? Something very inappropriate, correct? So here's David with Bathsheba, steals her away from her own husband, of which they both loved each other very much, steals her away, basically says, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because you know what? I am the king. And I can only imagine what Grandpa was thinking over there. How many of you, if that was your granddaughter, would have said, how dare you, king? But what do you say to the king? He's the king of all things. And so I can only imagine how upset really Ahithophel was about this. And at that point, it seems like that's where he left. And he goes away and he says, I'm going to be away from you, David. I can't be there. And so when Absalom says, I want to start a rebellion against this guy by the name of King David, he sends for Ahithophel, and Ahithophel says, sign me up. And it's there that the conspiracy begins. And the conspiracy goes on. We're not going to read in the section, but basically this conspiracy goes on. He starts pulling people. Thousands upon thousands of the people of Israel begin to come until finally word gets back to David. David, there is a conspiracy afoot, and they're going to kill you, and they're going to take care of anybody else who's with you. And so David says, it's time to go. David leaves Jerusalem, the capital city, the place where he's supposed to be. David leaves Jerusalem. Why? Because of somebody by the name of Absalom and Ahithophel, who are very power-hungry people. And how do these power-hungry people actually do it? Ahithophel says to Absalom, here's the way to show your power. You know what it is? I want you to go and see all the king's concubines that he leaves in Jerusalem. He says, go and make a public spectacle. Let's put a tent up on the top of the building, and there you may have sex with them, and you can prove to Israel that you are now the king, not your dad. And so sure enough, that's what he does. And he builds this tent right on the palace roof. That's how he gives the example to the people that he is now the king. Well, that goes back to 2 Samuel chapter 12, when, if you remember, when after David and Bathsheba, Nathan goes to him and he says, listen, David, what you did in secret, somebody coming after you will do in full view of all of Israel. And the prophecy was fulfilled. Here's David thinking that he's the king, when in reality his power is being stolen away. And I'll tell you, we look at this as Christians. We live in what we used to call a Christian nation. I don't believe we live in a Christian nation anymore. I really think that America, in fact, many people call it today a post-Christian America. And what has happened? Power-hungry people have come along. And they've taken, and they've taken, and they've taken. And as things have been removed, whether it's in society, whether it's been in our schools, whatever it is, and oftentimes, you know how it's been done? Right under the noses of Christians. Now, I'm not proposing that we just all of a sudden become political activists. We take back America. That's not what I'm proposing. You know, God never is completely dependent upon governments to do His will. God is above that, and we're going to see that in just a second. You see, though, God is not scared of power-hungry people. It's interesting how Absalom, the only time he really mentions God is when he says to his dad, oh, by the way, I need to go up to Hebron to sacrifice something to God. It was just a sham. And there are people in this day who will claim the name of God. They will say whatever needs to be said to be able to get the power that they want. And I don't care which party it is. They will say what needs to be said. The goal is, it's power, it's influence, it's all of that. And we as Christians need to be aware that there are power-hungry people all around us. And if we get so wrapped up in thinking that if this person gets in office or if this person gets in office, either life is amazing or life is horrible, we can forget that God can handle power-hungry people. I want you to notice something as we go through. I want you to see there in chapter 16. It wasn't 16. I'm not exactly sure where it was. Anyway, it's a section in there. One of the things that God says was that when it came to Ahithophel, it says that God used a man by the name of Hushai to frustrate the plans of Ahithophel. Ahithophel had a great idea. Let's kill David, let's take care of him, let's knock him down while he's weak. And sure enough, God says, I am still in control. And so he used bad advice to get his will done, to save the life of David, to be able to keep him away from the power-hungry person by the name of Absalom. And sure enough, that's what he did. And he was saved. Even though Absalom was better looking and he had all the right things, he was conniving, he had charm, he had all those things going for him, and yet he was still nothing when it came to the works of God in his life. And I want you to turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. Keep your finger in 2 Samuel. We're coming back there. Daniel chapter 4. Ezekiel is the book just before it, in case you get there. Daniel chapter 4. In verse 34. Daniel 4:34. There was a man by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most powerful kings that ever lived on the earth. He had tremendous power, influence, wealth. He had everything going for him. He was the king of the Babylonian Empire. And it's really interesting because one day Nebuchadnezzar walks out on his balcony and he looks out over his place and he says, "Aren't I amazing? I am so amazing because this is all that I've done." And God has to say, yeah, we're not going to work like this. And so for 7 years, it says that Nebuchadnezzar lived like an animal out in the wilderness, and he grew all sorts of things, depending on how you explain all the passage there. And that's what he did. He basically became crazy. And at the end of the 7 years, it's really interesting. At the end of the 7 years, he finally understands, and he comes to his senses. And it says there, Nebuchadnezzar's own words, "At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified Him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as He pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything He does is right, and all His ways are just, and those who walk in pride He is able to humble." And I want us to think about that with our political climate. I want you to think about that with people who are very prideful around you. I want you to think of the people who seem to be living above God. That even though we look at them and we think, my goodness, look at all the things that they have. Look at all the power that they have. Look at the media influence that they have. Look at all these things. And we can sit there and get into a panic and begin. If we don't chew our nails yet, we can start. Whatever it is, we get to those moments, we get so stressed and frustrated. We got to come back and say, God, don't take my peace, because you can handle them. No matter what the election results are coming up in the second Tuesday in November, who knows when we'll find out the results of it anyway. No matter what the results are, God will still be able to handle it, and He will still be on the throne. And so if your peace and your joy is being taken, I want to pull you back, and I want to remind you of the God that we serve, because God can handle power-hungry people. Here's another thing He can handle: passive parenting. The thing is, as we look through David's life, it's really interesting what the text says about David. Here's the thing: David didn't discipline, he didn't deal with Absalom after Tamar. He didn't deal with Amnon. Remember, Amnon was the one that did the horrible deed to his own sister, and yet all that David does is he gets upset, and he really doesn't deal with it. He doesn't make it right. He doesn't deal with Absalom after Absalom killed his own brother for this whole thing. He doesn't deal with him. There's a really interesting verse. If you go back to 2 Samuel, keep your finger there, but turn over just a couple pages to the right to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 1. We read about another brother of David here. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. 1 Kings 1 and verse 5, it says, Now Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, I will be king. So he got chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. Sounds like a familiar thing, doesn't it? Isn't that what Absalom just did himself? Verse 6, his father, whose by the name is David, had never interfered with him by asking, Why do you behave as you do? He was also very handsome and was born next after Absalom. That passage there, his father had never interfered with him by asking, Why do you even do what you do? Parenting is hard. How many of you have figured that out? There are some children who are easier to parent than others. Can I get any amens to that? As we look at the situation that we have before us, it's very interesting as we face the challenges of parenting. And there will be times and there will be days where you as a parent want to say, you know what? It ain't worth the fight. How many of you have been tempted to say that or do that at some point? It's just not worth it. And there are going to be times where as parents you're going to have to say, you know what? All right, do your thing. I don't know what's going to happen, but you need to do your thing. But then there are also going to be other times as parents when you're going to have to wade right into that fire, right into the middle of the fray, and you're going to have to stop trying to be a best friend and be a parent. And in those moments, as you are facing that challenge, it will be scary and it will be potentially very hurtful, and you are stepping into no man's land at that point in time. As a parent, I had no idea how good I gave it to my own parents. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. When I look back as a kid, I can only imagine what my parents thought about at times. In fact, I remember a time in their lives, in my own life, where I tried every which way to make my parents as miserable as possible. I was 16 years old, and that's what I was bound and determined to do. My job was to simply do that. I didn't even know at that point in time what I even wanted from my parents. All I know is I was mad, I was upset, and I wanted everybody else mad and upset around me. As I look back on it now, I am so grateful for my parents. I'm so thankful for the way in which they continued to parent me. And they didn't go passive. They continued to love me and they continued to support me. They continued to hold me accountable within reason. And I am so thankful for the parenting that I received. And yet it's interesting how David here, even though he's got these kids who are troublesome and who knows what else is going on, he seems to just say, you know what? Do what you're going to do. He doesn't even ask him, where are you going? What are you doing? Why are you behaving like this? What's happening? Now, before we just stand in the judgment seat of David, honestly, this passage scared the living daylights out of me. Because there's so little in here that's easy to be able to say, oh, this is exactly what it is, because I think we're learning from David's bad example in his life. There are times when we can learn from somebody, we say, oh, wasn't David amazing how he handled it here? Wasn't he amazing how he did this here? Oh, the faith he had with Goliath and the way in which he humbled himself here. I think what we're seeing here in this particular section is how David had gone passive. I looked up the definition of passivity, and it says passivity is acceptance of what happens without active response or resistance. Acceptance of what happens without active response or resistance. I know there have been times in my life where I have been very passive. I have been a passive husband at times, to the detriment of my family, where it was just easier just to say, you know what, it is what it is. I've been a passive father at times because it's been easier just to say, you know what? Do what you're going to do. I don't know, and in all honesty, I don't know when that right time is to be able to say, here's where I need to stand firm, and here's where I need to say, let go. I don't claim to be the expert. I don't think we can turn to this passage and say, oh, in these 3 examples, this is when you need to stand firm. Or in these 2 examples, this is when you just need to let it go. I don't think we have that. I think God designed us to live in a moment-by-moment, daily dependence on Him. And the only way we're going to know how to stand firm when we need to and when to step away when we don't, the only way we're going to know that is through an ongoing, intimate relationship with Him. But doggone it, people, and I say it to myself, when we stop parenting like we desperately need God every single moment of every single day, we're going to get to a place in which we think, I can handle it. We're going to get to a place in which we think, I'm the one responsible to make sure my kids turn out the way they should, versus saying, God, I need you every moment of every single day. And if that means I have to stop being my kid's best friend, and my kids are not going to like me for this, then I trust you. If it means that I have to wade into that fire, God, I'm going to need other people around me. I just got a text this morning. Kathy, thank you. I just got a text this morning saying, hey, you know what? I really feel challenged and convicted. We need to be praying more for our kids. I will tell you guys, kids have a huge target on them today. They have a huge target. And there are so many voices pouring into kids. And not just all kids, but adults and everybody. There are so many targets out there. And so Kathy's thing was saying, hey, can we get together and pray for our kids? And I'm thinking, sign me up. We need to be doing it more. We need the support. We need the encouragement. Because you know what? It's so tempting nowadays to simply go passive. It's going to happen. We live in a crazy world. Oh, God, you take care of them. But God has given you them to parent. And so I just ask, are you passive today? Are you passive about maybe things in your family? Have you ever heard of a thing called generational curses? You ever heard of that before? You know, I've struggled with that over the years. It seems like some families are ravaged by certain things. Why is it this thing seems to happen in a family more so than in this thing to this family over here? Why is it that this anger issue that seems to be in a family continues on and continues on and continues on and continues on? Why is it that alcoholism just continues to go? And why is it that abuse, sexual, physical, whatever it is, why does it seem to go and stay within families? And some have said it's because of generational sin. It's because of generational curses. And so we're going to come back here, but I want you to look at Exodus chapter 20. If you can turn there, please. Because this is the passage that's most often used for when it comes to general curses. Exodus chapter 20, second book of the Old Testament, second book of the Bible. It is the Ten Commandments. It's the giving of the Ten Commandments. And so, it says there in verse 3, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." It's really interesting. I am a jealous God, God says. I am a God who cares about what people think. And when you put other people and other gods before me, I care about that. And there are things that are going to happen. And there will be discipline. There will be punishment that comes when we put others before God. And so often what we do is we put, especially in our modern day world, we put kids before God. We put the needs of our kids, and we put the things of our kids, and we hold our kids up as idols. And I think we flip-flopped from a couple generations ago where kids were to be seen and not heard. And nowadays we flipped it around and we worship kids. And so when we pursue kids and we pursue that relationship more so than with kids, oftentimes we begin to serve the kids. We begin to serve their needs and serve their wants rather than saying, "God, I serve you and I trust you with the kids." And so when we begin to serve our kids, or we begin to serve money, or we begin to serve things, or we begin to serve whatever else, we eventually become enslaved by those things. And so it's interesting how we we look and we say, "Oh yeah, it's just dad. It's just dad's temper." And we wonder why kids have a massive temper. "Oh yeah, it's just grandma's alcoholism." And we wonder why the alcoholism continues on. We say, "Oh, it's just my mother's gossip." Or grandpa's womanizing. "Oh yes, these things were a part of our story, but let's just move on." And we wonder why these things continue on and continue on. I think the answer is in the passage there. Punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. The opposite of love is hate. And so often when we put others, other people, other things, whatever above God, it's basically like we're saying to God, "God, it's almost like I'm saying I hate you because I'd rather serve this. I'd rather be there." And so God says there is a plan and a purpose for how we live. And if you don't live according to this design and according to this purpose, you're going to find yourself in the weeds. And I think that's what ends up happening. But then he goes on to say, "But showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." At some point, and I'll tell you, I look around this room and I see testimonies of it. I look around this room and at some point, somebody says, "Enough's enough. We will break the curse that seems to be on this family." God's power and God's love is far greater than any sort of curse that may have been passed down by my dad who was mad all the time, or my grandpa who was womanizing all the time, or the abuse that I had, or the gossip, or the temper, or whatever. God is far bigger than that. And therefore, God, I'm going to stop being victimized by the generations that have gone before me. And I'm going to say, "God, I love you and I trust you." And that's what happens. That's the change that ends up taking place. And when God says that, he says, I love you, and I will bless you for 1,000 generations. Yes, all this garbage is in your past, but I will tell you, through non-passive parenting, through that, we can certainly have a different world in which we live. So, power-hungry people, God says, I can handle them. Passive parenting, God says, I can handle them. We just have a couple more here as we wrap it up. Misplaced perspectives. Misplaced perspective. If you jump over to 1833. What we skipped over was there was a battle that ensued. Finally, David said, you know what? I can't run. I can't get away anymore. We're going to have a battle. And they fought. And through that whole thing, it's kind of funny in the text. I know it's sad because somebody lost their life, but it's kind of funny in the text how it says that Absalom's hair is what killed him. He was riding his mule, and he's riding as fast as he can to get away. And there was a crook in the tree. And as he rode his mule underneath of it, his hair got caught, which is why I'm picturing this big fro. His hair gets caught in the crook of the tree, and he's stuck. And he's dangling there from the tree, kind of like, guys, can somebody help me out? All of his men scatter, and he's there by himself. And that's when one of David's men finds him. And they says to Joab, who was the general at the time, he says, Joab, now we can get him. If we kill Absalom, we can do it. But don't you remember that David said, please don't kill my son. Please don't kill him. I know he's trying to kill me, but don't kill him. Deal with him gently. Joab says, I don't care what David said, we're going to go kill him. So he says he went there and he took 3 daggers and he jammed 3 daggers into his heart. Now I would think that if you had 3 daggers jagged into your heart, driven into your heart, you'd be dead. But the text says that his men eventually came along and finished him off. So here you have Absalom who's hanging there. And it's really interesting, David's response. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33. He says, the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and he wept. As he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Here's a father who is grief-stricken. And Joab says, listen, buddy, you got to shake out of this thing. Joab went into the house to the king and he said, today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. Listen to that phrase. You love those who hate you and you hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men meant nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come upon you from your youth till now. So David gets a chastisement by his general. His general has to come along and say, listen, if you don't change your tune right now, everybody's going to leave you. And at that moment, David had to say, wow, my perspective is definitely in the wrong place. It's so easy to get there when we look at our life and when we look at things and we look at the political climate, we look at our situation in our families, or we look at these things and we say, oh God, it's all about this, and we become so focused. And sometimes God has to send people along to bring us back to get a biblical perspective. And so I'll ask you this, who might God use in your life to bring a biblical perspective back? Who do you have that you let them speak into your life to bring a biblical perspective back? Maybe you're in a situation, in a time of life in which you're living the way you want to live. And we need to say, okay, God, who would you have to speak into us to bring our perspective back to where it needs to be? But then the last one, and I wanted to hit this, and sorry I skipped over the last one too quick. But this last one, life-giving provisions. Life-giving provision. God can handle this. If you jump back to chapter 17, when David was on the run, he had to leave quickly. And so it says here, when David came to Mahanaim, some names that are hard to pronounce, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery. They also brought wheat and barley, flour and roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curd, sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. For they said, the people have become hungry and tired and thirsty in the desert. This passage, this whole thing, there are so many people who came along David's side. When he's feeling down, when he's feeling discouraged, when he's depressed, when he feels like the whole world is against him, it's like God was bringing people, weaving them into his life, in which he was reminded, God can handle this. God can handle this. And so not only can he handle the stuff of life, which was the things, the thing that I wanted to point out more was how God can handle the people. I specifically want to deal with the two topics here of politics and parenting. Right now, who do you have that is speaking into your life when it comes to politics? Do you only have certain people who are constantly feeding you and building up the frenzy? Or do you have people who are reminding you that God can handle even the political situation in which we're in today? Because I watch it on both sides. Both sides are so discouraged, so frustrated and so worried about what's going to happen in this election. Do you have people who are coming along and saying, you know what? It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. We just simply need to trust. But then also when I think of the parenting side, I got to tell you, for myself this morning when I got the text, it was an encouragement. It was really interesting how God used Kathy right there to just send the text that encouraged me. Encouraged us as we go through some challenges of our own when it comes to parenting. Encouraging us to just continue to trust. God can handle this. God can handle this. And so I don't know what you're facing, and I don't know what you're dealing with. I don't know how your joy has been taken. But if you're struggling to live that reality of God can handle this, I want you to remember that God can handle bringing along the things, the stuff that you need to keep going, but He can also handle bringing along the people that can speak to you when you need it, just the way you need it. He can handle those sort of things. God can handle it. I guess that's the point. And so as we look at our last challenge here. Out of 7 chapters, how do we boil it all down? Really what it comes down to is God is in control. He can handle it. And so if you're looking at your trials and you're seeing your challenges as things that are causing you anxiety and depression and all those sort of things, I want you to step back and I want you to think of how big God is. And I want you to go back and reread this. It's a fascinating saga as you read through this. If you get the names you can't pronounce, just skip over them. I do the same thing. So as we go through that same thing, as you read and as you are encouraged, I hope that the idea that God is in control, that God is truly bigger than anybody else or anything else, really stands out. And He says, you can do it if you trust me. So let God simply do that in your life. And so I'm going to ask the band to come on back up here as I close in prayer here. Lord, I just, this is a hard passage. It's hard because there's so much here, and there's bad examples. I think there's good examples. It's just life. And Lord, I guess it feels kind of like our lives. It's messy. Doing life with you is messy. When I think of what it means to trust you, it really is in the good times, it's in the bad times. When things are good, it's super easy to trust you. When things are challenging, it's a whole lot harder to trust you. But I pray that the challenges that even I'm facing, the challenges that we are facing as a people, the challenges that we are facing as Christians, as the church, may we continue to keep our eyes on you, remembering that it is through the gospel that this world is going to change. It's not going to change because we change it. It's going to change because you are changing hearts. You are changing lives. And so, God, I just pray that we would be people of faith, that you would give us the faith that we need to trust you more, that we would see your hand in it all, and that as we walk with you, we wouldn't be scared, we wouldn't try to run away, we would face it head on, that you would deal with our passivity as parents. You would deal with the people in our lives that we feel are just too powerful. And you would remind us that you are bigger than them. When our perspectives get off, when they become misplaced and we begin focusing on the bad things more than the good things, that you would bring our focus back there. But also, God, provide the people we need to give us life, to just remember who you are and what you've done for us and how you never leave us and you never forsake us. So, God, we trust you more. We give this to you. In Jesus' name we pray. And all those in agreement said, amen.
Amen. Thank you, John.